When getting into embroidery, we must first understand the process of embroidery. How do we actually get a design from a business card or maybe say from the internet and get that onto the machine, stitching, and create a final product? Usually the embroidery process starts with digitizing, or the art of taking an image such as the business card or the image from the business card, a JPEG or something from the internet, and converting that to an embroidery design so that the machine can actually understand it. The machine is actually more of our simple step in the whole process, in that the machine understands commands. It understands where to put down the stitching. It understands when to change the needle or change the color in the design, and also when to understand trims, stops, and other functions such as that. So we actually first start with the design process. And in the design process, it is taking an image and converting it to stitching. Not only is it converting it to stitching, but it's converting it to special stitch types. And these are the stitch types and the terminology that we use within the industry. Now it may vary from person to person, from company to company, but it's all pretty universal. When we look at a design and how it's composed, we can see that different areas are filled with different stitch types, which give us different textures and gives us dimension of the design. We do have three main stitch types when we are talking about digitizing, and we'll explore those stitch types. One, how they're composed, how they differ, and what components go along with those stitch types. So we will revisit this design after we explore the stitch types that go along in digitizing. Now, in order to see the three different stitch types that we're talking about, we're going to go ahead and change our screen to see the three S's. And in here, each one is a little bit different. The first one is a satin stitch, the second one is a complex fill, and the third one is a running stitch, which is also a variation of the complex fill. Now some people may call a satin stitch a column stitch, and some people may call a complex fill a tatami or a step stitch. Let's explore what each one is and how it works. So in our first S, it is a satin stitch, and a satin stitch looks very smooth, and we mainly see satin stitching in lettering, in outlines, smaller detail work, and also we see it in specialty effects such as 3D puffy foam or 3D embroidery. The way a satin stitch is composed is much different than a complex fill, which we see in the second one over here. So let's first look at the satin stitch. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select this and zoom in just on this satin stitch so it's in the center of our screen. Now if you see my blue and white flashing lines, that is the shape of what we are filling in with stitches. And we are filling in this area with satin stitching. Satin stitching is a little bit more complex in the way that we describe a complex fill. A satin stitch has multiple angles, meaning that as it follows the shape of a design, or follows the shape to do the embroidery in, it will have several transitions from angle to angle as it stitches around the design. If we look in our angle view, we can see that here. I'm going to go ahead and left click on this view angle, and we can see several red lines going across the S. And what this is our stitching. Our stitching will follow this angle. It'll go back and forth according to this angle, and as it moves from one angle to another, it's going to transition. So it transitions from one angle to another angle, and you'll see it start to move and change. It'll transition then from this angle to this angle, and as it snakes around, You can see it has several angles that it's following. So let's go back to the satin stitch, and we can kind of see that a little bit more. We can see that the stitching will go left to right and follow that angle, and as it moves up, it's going to move to a different angle, transition, and it's going to, as it goes around, it's going to move to another angle. This may not be so apparent in the 3D mode, so let's go ahead and turn that off. We'll go ahead and zoom in on the top here, and as we see our stitching, it will go and follow this angle, and as it goes and moves, it's going to transition. Now, another characteristic of a satin stitch is that it follows just on the edges of our shape. The stitching follows the edges of our shape, so there's no stitching in between. And what I mean by that is that we'll go ahead and show our needle penetrations, that as it goes and follows that angle, it'll go back and forth without stitching in between. What you see, these little stitches in here, that's actually called my underlay, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And just for demonstration purposes, we'll go ahead and turn off the underlay within my stitch properties. Actually, we'll go here and turn that off. Go ahead and press OK. So now we can see this a little bit better. As we follow the shape and fill it with satin stitching, it will go on each side of that shape from side A to side B and not put any stitching in between. That's what gives it that smooth look. So you don't have any stitch points that drop down in the center here. It'll just go and follow that shape. And as it follows that shape, it follows that transition. Remember, here are our transitions, and you can see how that translates into our stitching. So when we look at that in more of a realistic view, it looks nice and smooth. Now, the main thing to remember about a satin stitch is that it does follow the shape just by putting stitching on the edging of that shape, as well as following the multiple angles. Now, we can vary that satin stitch and make it look differently by changing the properties within the satin stitch, maybe by changing angles or by changing the satin stitch type. So let's go ahead and we'll zoom that whole design again and look at the next stitch type. The next stitch type is our complex fill. Now, a complex fill is much different than a satin stitch. You can see that it looks like it has more texture to it. And what a complex fill does that's much different than a satin stitch is that it only follows one angle. If I zoom in at the top of my stitch, or my S here, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, it actually only follows one angle. So all the stitches are flowing in the same direction within this shape. In addition, you can see that it does have more texture, so as it follows the shape, it's filling in stitches as it goes back and forth in the angle of the stitching. Let's go ahead and right click on this area and we'll zoom back out so we can see the angle. There's our angle right here, and the angle is going in this direction, so our stitching is going in that direction. And as our stitching fills this S, it's going to fill it in the set direction with multiple stitch points. Now, we have several different properties that we can change about this, but if we change the direction of this area just by left clicking, holding and dragging and regenerating our stitches, you can see that the whole section changes. That's very different than a satin stitch, because a satin stitch has multiple angles, and if you change one angle, it's only going to change that little portion of that design. So the main thing about a complex fill is that it does follow one angle and it fills the area in with multiple points rather than just going back and forth from side to side following that shape. So it does give it more texture, and also it gives it quite a bit more stitches. So if we can see here on this S, which is quite large, it has 13,000 stitches, whereas on this S right here it has 1,797. That's quite a jump. So as we can see, those are the two big differences between those two stitch types. Now our third S that we have here on the right hand side, this is a line stitch. This stitching is followed on a line, like an outline, and it is called a running stitch. With a running stitch, it looks like a traditional sewing stitch, and it is actually a variation of a complex fill because it does follow multiple stitch points. And it follows those multiple stitch points so we can create that shape. Now the difference between this S on the right hand side here, that it's not filled in, is because this has been digitized as a line, whereas these two have been digitized as areas. Areas are filled with stitching, whereas lines are not filled with stitching. It just follows the line itself. So in seeing the different stitch types here, what we're going to do is go back to the design that we first saw and look at different parts of the design and see the differences in stitch types. So we're going to zoom in here on his face, and if we look at it, we can see that the green face and ears and the tan part of his face, those are all complex fills, as well as part of his eyes, the white part of his eyes, the inside red and blue of his mouth, and his hat up here. Those are all complex fills. The outline, this solid outline, or this thicker outline that you see in black here, those are satin stitches. Like I said before, you do mostly see those in outlines, things like that. The smaller detail work, such as the wrinkles in his hat and around his eyebrows, those are running stitches. Now there are variations of running stitches in that you can have a single run, a double run, and a triple run. And each one of those are going to give a little bit of a different effect because of how many times it actually runs around the area. But we can see that just in this small area we do have the three different stitch types. And within these stitch types you can see the different angles will give it different texture. And these are very basic complex fills, satin stitches, and running stitches. Now not only is it important to understand the different stitch types of embroidery, but also the different stitch properties. Because different stitch properties can work in conjunction with the other parts of the embroidery. And what I mean by other parts, I mean the garment that you're stitching on, the material you're stitching on, what kind of frame or hoop that you're using, the backing or the stabilizer you may be using, the thread that you're using, the thread weight, as well as the bobbin. All these different things can affect your final embroidery. But it also works in conjunction with digitizing, and understanding what a design is composed of can help us make the right decisions for what we have, for the other things that we have involved in our final embroidery. Now when stitching, we have to understand the different parts of embroidery, such as I was saying before. The biggest part is going to be our fabric and understanding the different fabric types. Whenever we do make a stitch into the fabric, our needle is passing through the fabric, whether it be pushing aside the fibers of the fabric, making room for that thread to pass through, or actually poking through the fabric and making a needle penetration. Whatever it may be, that causes the fabric to displace, also creating a push and pull effect. because as your machine will go down through the fabric, or as the needle will go down and up through the fabric, it will displace the fabric, again pushing those fibers aside or actually making a hole in the fabric. But also as your presser foot goes up and down and moves along with the pantograph, it can push and also pull the fabric. So there are different things in digitizing to help accommodate for those types of things. And let's go ahead and look more in depth at those different features. Now as we move from fabric to fabric, things may change a little bit, because if we look at the difference between, let's say, a fine linen towel versus a heavy terry cloth towel, you can just feel the difference there. You may need less stitching in the linen than you would in the terry cloth. So let's go back to our 3 S's. I'm going to go ahead and use the stitch player here and show you what happens when we start stitching this design. When I stitch this design, it has something called an underlay stitch. This underlay stitch usually is a very open stitch or open density stitch, and this lays the foundation of our design. This stitch does a couple of things in that it will help stabilize the fabric, and it'll also adhere the backing of the stabilizer to the material. Then you see it come on top and do what we call the cover stitch, and in this case it's doing a satin stitch. This is that final stitch that we see, and it goes over and covers over on top of the underlay. Now in addition to the underlay helping that material stabilize, we do have the stabilizer or the backing in addition. That stabilizer, the backing, is exactly what it says. It stabilizes the material. You'll see that your stabilizer or your backing does not have any push and pull to it. So it helps that fabric keep from moving. So on the second S, you see our complex fill going on top of the underlay stitch. You notice too that our underlay stitch is different on a complex fill than it is on the satin stitch. And usually we want our underlay stitch on a complex fill to go 90 degrees to the complex fill cover stitch, and that's what we see here. So they're going in opposite directions and helping that material help the material prevent from too much movement, and help stabilize that material. So you can see that. Let's go ahead and hurry that up. And this has a lot more stitching than that satin stitch on the left hand side. It is going in one direction and it is filling with multiple stitches. So usually that's what we see when we stitch out a design. We see that it usually has an open stitch underneath, and again that is kind of the foundation. It helps keep everything from moving too much. Another important part to digitizing besides the underlay is the pull compensation. Now pull compensation refers to the pushing out of threads beyond the actual area, or the pulling in of threads beyond the actual area, depending upon which way the needle is going, because it can push the fabric and pull the fabric as your machine sews along. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here, and I'm going to show you what pull compensation actually is. We're going to turn it off for the 3D view, and I'm going to select the area. With the area selected, you can see the blue and white flashing lines. That is my actual area, or what has been programmed into the digitizing software. You can see that my needle penetrations, I'm going to zoom in even further here, actually go beyond that blue and white flashing line. That's to help accommodate for the push and pull of the material as the machine goes back and forth on the material. So again, as that presser foot goes up and down on your material and the pantograph moves, the pantograph is actually guiding your material, and the needle is going up and down to create that pattern. And as the needle goes up and down, the pantograph moves, that presser foot's going to push against the fabric and pull against the fabric. So again, to help with that, to help stabilize the fabric and to help keep that fabric from moving, we have that underlay, but we also have the pull compensation, which are these. This is our standard pull compensation, and that is the stitches that extend beyond the actual area of programming. And that blue and white flashing line again is our main area. So those are the two big things that we need to understand about embroidery that can really affect how our embroidery will turn out. And again, we need to keep in mind that embroidery is not just digitizing and not just the machine. It's a combination of all of the above, including the garment, the backing, the bobbins, the thread, the needles that you're using, and the thread weight, as well as the digitizing. But digitizing can be a huge aspect in everything.